Welcome to Horror Echo. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from and the time. Now, relax and join me on a journey into the unknown. Story 1, The Last Call. It was a quiet night at the small 24-hour convenience store in the middle of nowhere. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting an eerie glow over the rows of snacks and sodas. Jake, the night shift worker, was used to the solitude, the endless hours of quiet, the sounds of his own breathing, and the occasional beep of the register. The clock ticked past midnight, and the usual late-night crowd had come and gone. A few drifters, tired from long drives, had grabbed some coffee or a candy bar. The store was nearly empty, save for the constant hum of the refrigerators and the low buzz of the lights. Jake had just finished restocking the shelves and was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through his phone, when the doorbell jingled. A man walked in, wearing a long, dark coat. He was tall, with messy hair, and his face was hidden under the hood. Jake barely looked up, figuring it was just another late-night customer in need of a quick snack. The man walked to the back of the store without a word, his footsteps barely audible on the old linoleum floors. It was strange, though. The man's presence felt unsettling, almost unnatural. The store had always been quiet, but tonight, something about it felt off. The air was heavy, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He quickly dismissed it, convincing himself it was just the loneliness playing tricks on his mind. About 5 minutes later, the man returned to the front of the store, holding a can of soda in one hand. He didn't approach the counter immediately. Instead, he stood near the aisles, glancing around as if unsure of what to do. Jake raised an eyebrow and, with a forced smile, asked, "Can I help you with anything, sir?" The man didn't respond at first. He just stood there, staring at Jake for what felt like an eternity. His gaze was cold, hollow, as if there was nothing behind those eyes. "Hi. I just need to pay for the soda," the man finally muttered, his voice raspy and distant. Jake nodded, relieved that the interaction was so brief. He began to ring up the soda when he noticed something strange. The man wasn't pulling out his wallet. Instead, his hand was resting at his side, holding something in the folds of his coat. "Do you have money for that?" Jake asked, glancing up. The man's head jerked up, his eyes locking onto Jake's. "Hi. I just need it. It's not about money." Jake felt his heart race. There was something wrong here, something he couldn't quite place. His hands shook as he processed the soda, unsure of how to proceed. But just as he was about to tell the man he couldn't leave without paying, the doorbell jingled again. The man's eyes shot to the door, and he quickly spun around. The new customer had entered, a woman, dressed in a loose, flowy white dress that seemed out of place in the dimly lit store. She walked straight to the counter without a word, as if she had been here before. Jake was confused. How had she gotten in? The man hadn't let her in. She must have come in with him, but he hadn't seen her. Jake glanced back at the man, but to his horror, the man had vanished. There was no sign of him, no coat, no soda, nothing. Only the strange woman stood there now, smiling as if she knew something Jake didn't. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice oddly comforting yet unsettling. "Hi. I don't know," Jake stammered, still processing the disappearance. "Who was that man? Where did he go?" The woman tilted her head and smiled wider, her teeth just slightly too sharp. "Don't worry. He was just here to make sure you'd be ready." Jake's blood ran cold. Ready for what? But before the woman could answer, the doorbell jingled again, and another figure appeared, walking in from the street. This time, Jake didn't even need to ask. He knew, deep down, that the next part of the night had just begun. Jake stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman at the counter was still there, her cold smile growing wider as the footsteps of the man disappeared into the shadows of the store. His head was spinning. Had it all been some kind of hallucination? A trick of his mind? Or was there something far more sinister at play? Before he could process the bizarre event, the doorbell rang again. A cold gust of wind swept in with the sound of the jingle, and this time, Jake didn't even have to look. He knew who it was. The figure, the tall man in the long coat, was standing in the doorway once more. But this time, there was something different. He wasn't alone. Behind him, in the dim light outside, Jake could see several more figures, all in dark clothing, huddled together like a shadowy crowd. Their faces were obscured by hoods, but there was a sense of knowing in their presence. It felt as if they had been waiting for something, or someone. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the man in the coat stepped forward, his eyes glinting in the flickering light. "You've been marked," the man said, his voice low and cold. Jake's pulse raced, his hands trembling as he instinctively reached for the phone under the counter. He wanted to call the police, wanted to do something, anything to protect himself. But before he could dial a number, the woman behind him spoke up. "Don't bother," she said softly, her smile now fading into something darker. "They won't come. They never do." The hair on the back of Jake's neck stood up. Something wasn't right, something far beyond what he could explain. The man in the coat took another step forward, his figure seeming to stretch unnaturally tall. He was so close now that Jake could feel the cold emanating from him, a chill that seeped deep into his bones. "Why are you doing this?" Jake whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. He felt cornered, trapped. "Who are you?" The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "We're the ones who make sure things happen. We are the ones who deliver the last call." Jake's heart raced even faster, and his mind swam with a million questions. What was this? A cult? A gang? A group of supernatural beings? He had no idea, but the truth of the situation was becoming all too real. "Why me?" Jake's voice cracked. "What do you want from me?" The man took another step closer, his cold eyes locking onto Jake's. "You were always meant to be here. You were chosen. We've been watching." The air in the store grew even heavier, and Jake felt as though he couldn't breathe. The woman's eerie presence behind him made it even worse. The figures outside the door were still there, watching, waiting. It felt like the entire world was closing in on him. Suddenly, the man turned to the side, his head jerking towards the back of the store, where the shelves met the far wall. The other figures stepped forward in unison, their movements synchronized in a way that made Jake's stomach turn. "You're not just a witness," the man continued, his voice eerily calm. "You're part of the plan now." Before Jake could process his next move, the lights flickered once more, plunging the store into darkness. The air grew heavy, and Jake could hear the sound of faint whispers coming from the shadows. The hairs on his arms stood on end as a cold sweat began to form on his brow. Who are you people?" Jake managed to whisper, his voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured for the others to step closer. And that's when Jake saw it, the thing that made his heart drop into his stomach. Behind the group, near the back of the store, the shadows began to form into something real. It was a shape, tall, dark, and grotesque. Its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally long, with hands that reached down to the floor, scraping against the tiles. Its head was low, its eyes glowing an eerie red. And as the figure stepped into the dim light, Jake saw the face, if it could even be called that. The face was distorted, twisted in a way that made his skin crawl. The features were vague, melting in and out of existence, as though the creature was trying to keep its true form hidden from view. But Jake could feel it. This thing wasn't human. The figure let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated through the store and rattled the shelves. Jake took an instinctive step back, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. "You've been chosen," the man repeated, his voice colder than ever. "And now, you will join us." Jake's mind reeled. Was this happening? Was he losing his grip on reality? The store felt like a different world now, a place where rules didn't apply, where reality twisted and bent like a dream that refused to wake. The creature's glowing eyes shifted to Jake, its head cocking to the side as if it were studying him. Then, in a voice that sounded both inhuman and eerily familiar, it spoke. "Time's up." The coldness of the words sunk into Jake's chest. The room seemed to close in on him as the dark figures around him took slow, deliberate steps forward, their faces still hidden by their hoods. Jake's legs felt weak, as if they were made of jelly. Every instinct told him to run, to escape, but the weight of the air around him, the force of the shadowy figures, kept him rooted in place. And then, everything went black. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs as darkness swallowed him whole. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one feeling like it was the last. He tried to move, to scream, but his body refused to cooperate. It was as if the shadows had wrapped themselves around him, paralyzing him in place. He could feel the presence of the figures around him, their coldness radiating like an oppressive weight. For what felt like an eternity, everything was still, silent, save for the pounding of his own heart and the slow, rhythmic hum of something deep within the store. But then, slowly, the blackness began to recede. Jake blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered back on, casting an eerie, unnatural glow over the store. The shelves, the snacks, the cold drinks, all seemed the same, but the air felt wrong. Heavy. The strange, dark figures were gone, but their presence lingered like a thick fog that refused to lift. He gasped, finally able to move again, stumbling backwards until he hit the counter. His hands scrambled for his phone, heart racing as he tried to dial the number for the police, but the screen was flickering, glitching as though the device itself was fighting against him. "No signal," he muttered under his breath, panic creeping into his voice. The woman, still standing behind the counter, was watching him, her smile now replaced with an unsettling, almost predatory expression. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft, sweet even, but laced with something dark beneath it. Jake backed away, his mind racing. What had just happened? Was he dreaming? Had it all been some twisted nightmare? But no, this felt too real. The cold, the dark figures, the whispers, they weren't figments of his imagination. "You were chosen," the woman continued, her voice growing colder. "You're part of the plan now." Jake's stomach twisted. "What plan? What do you want from me?" He could barely choke out the words. Her smile didn't waver. "You've already begun to understand. But there's still so much more to learn. You'll see soon enough." He turned and ran, the door slamming open as the cold night air rushed inside. The store was suffocating, the shadows of the past hour clinging to his skin like a heavy cloak. But the street outside was quiet, empty. No one was around. As he looked back at the store, something in the window caught his eye, a shadowy figure, barely visible in the corner. Jake's breath caught in his throat, his legs locking in place. It was the man, the tall one in the long coat. But this time, he wasn't standing still. He was moving, his figure blurring as if the darkness itself was taking shape around him. Jake stumbled backward into the street, eyes locked on the figure, until it vanished once again into the shadows. He had to get out of there. But as his feet hit the pavement, a voice behind him called out, sharp and unmistakable. "You're not free, Jake." He spun around, but no one was there. The shift that never ends. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, that the night had somehow altered its course. Every step felt like he was being pulled deeper into a nightmare, one that he couldn't escape. He ran, not knowing where he was going, just away from the store, away from the creeping sense of doom that clung to him. The road stretched ahead, empty, with nothing but the sound of his footsteps and the eerie hum of the world he used to know. The gas station, the convenience store, his entire life, it was all slipping away, like sand through his fingers. But then, without warning, he stopped. At the far end of the street, he saw it, another store. It was an old, abandoned building, its windows cracked and covered in grime. The lights were off, but there was a faint glow coming from within, just enough to make out the shape of a figure standing in the doorway. Jake's breath caught. He wasn't sure if it was the same man, the one who had been inside the convenience store, but there was something about this figure that felt familiar, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. Without thinking, he started walking toward it, his legs moving as if guided by an invisible force. The closer he got, the stronger the pull became. It was as though the building itself was calling him, beckoning him to step inside. And then, as he reached the door, it opened on its own. The air inside was thick, suffocating. A low, guttural noise filled the room, a hum that seemed to vibrate through his chest. The store was dark, the shelves empty, save for a few scattered objects, a bottle here, a broken chair there, but the most unsettling thing was the overwhelming sense of déjà vu. Everything about it felt wrong, yet so terribly familiar. "Welcome, Jake," the voice from the darkness echoed. It was the man in the long coat. But he wasn't alone. Around him, standing in a half-circle, were the same figures from the store. The woman, the shadowy crowd, all staring at him with their hollow, knowing eyes. Jake's pulse quickened, the weight of their gazes pressing down on him like a vice. "Did you really think you could escape?" the man in the coat asked, stepping closer, his figure towering over Jake. Jake's legs felt like lead, but his body refused to move. The man's voice was hypnotic, pulling at his very core. "You're part of something much bigger now. This is your new reality." The room began to shift. The walls seemed to bend, to twist and stretch in unnatural ways. Jake's vision blurred as the figures around him grew darker, more distorted, their faces melting into one grotesque shape. "You belong here," the woman's voice whispered from behind him. "And there's no going back." Jake opened his mouth to scream, to fight, to break free, but before a sound could escape, the world around him collapsed into shadow. And then, there was only silence. Jake's mind raced as the darkness closed in, his chest tightening with panic. The shadows twisted around him, pulling at his limbs like invisible hands. He tried to move, tried to break free, but his body refused to obey. It was as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled, leaving him trapped in a nightmare that had no end. The hum of the dark figures' voices filled his ears, whispers that were barely audible but seeped into his soul, filling him with dread. "You belong here now, Jake," the woman's voice echoed in his head, repeating like a mantra, "You can never leave." His vision swam in and out of focus, the world bending, warping, until it felt as though he were falling through space. He could hear the distant sound of the store's doorbell jingling, the eerie squeal of the refrigerator doors opening and closing, the faint rattle of the shelves. Then, everything stopped. The hum faded, the shadows receded, and the oppressive pressure that had been crushing him vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Jake blinked, struggling to regain his bearings. He was standing in the middle of the store again, as though nothing had happened. The shelves were intact, the lights buzzed overhead, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. But it felt wrong. The walls felt too close, the air too thick, like he was still caught between worlds. He looked around. The man in the coat was gone. The woman, the shadows, the figures, they were all gone. But in their place stood something far worse. In the back corner of the store, the creature, the one with glowing eyes and a twisted face, was standing there, watching him with an intensity that chilled him to his core. It was no longer a blurry figure in the shadows. Now, it was clear. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin a mottled, grayish hue, and its eyes, those deep, hollow eyes, pierced through him like cold steel. Jake couldn't move. His body was frozen, every instinct screaming at him to run, to scream, to fight. But there was no escape. Not anymore. The creature tilted its head, its mouth stretching into an inhuman grin. Its voice was a guttural growl, deep and raspy. "You can't hide from the truth, Jake. You've already chosen. You've already become one of us." Jake's heart sank. The weight of its words hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been chosen, but not for something good. Not for anything he could have ever imagined. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell once more. The door swung open, and a man in a long coat stepped inside. But this time, he wasn't alone. The others, the figures, entered with him, their eyes fixed on Jake, their movements synchronized as though they were all part of a single, monstrous entity. They filed into the store, surrounding him, cutting off every escape route. The tall man with the cold eyes approached, his voice low and calm. "You've come this far, Jake. You can't go back now." Jake tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat was tight, choked with fear. The creature in the corner let out a low, rumbling growl, its form shifting, its body twisting as it began to move toward him. The tall man raised a hand, halting the creature in its tracks. "Not yet," he said, almost affectionately. "He still needs to understand." Jake wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but his body betrayed him. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was trapped in a nightmare that was now his reality, and he was powerless to escape. The man in the coat stepped closer, his face cold, his smile chilling. "This is your world now. This is where you'll stay. The last call has been made." Jake felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and for the first time in his life, he understood the truth of those words. There was no escape. No one was coming to save him. He was lost in a world of darkness and shadows, where the rules of reality no longer applied. And as the creature's glowing eyes locked onto his, Jake finally understood what it meant to be chosen. He was theirs now. The end. Story 2, The Shadow in the Hallway. Night shifts at the old hospital were always long and tedious for Natalie, but they paid well, and she needed the money. Most of the time, the silence was the worst part. No patients, no visitors, just the occasional janitor mopping the floors in the empty hallways. She'd grown used to the eerie sounds of the old building, creaking floors, the hum of the lights, the distant beeping of machines from the wards. But one night, things took a turn that she couldn't explain. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Natalie heard the first strange noise. She was sitting at the nurse's station, reviewing patient charts, when she heard footsteps echo down the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone were walking toward her. But the hallway was empty. She had just checked. No one was there. Her heart raced as the sound grew louder, the footsteps growing closer and closer, until it seemed as though someone was standing right outside the station, breathing heavily. Natalie stood up, trying to steady her nerves. She peered through the window in the door, expecting to see one of the patients or staff members. But there was nothing, no one at all. Just darkness. Confused, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. At first, she saw nothing unusual. The lights flickered overhead, and the hall stretched into an eerie void of shadows. But then, she saw it. A figure, a man, or at least it appeared to be a man, was standing at the end of the hallway. He was tall and thin, his body bent at an unnatural angle. His face was covered in shadow, and he stood motionless, staring at her with what looked like hollow eyes. Natalie froze. Something about him felt wrong, too wrong to be real. She tried to call out, but her voice was lost in the silence. The figure didn't move, he just watched. Then, in an instant, he was gone. The hallway was empty again. Natalie's breath caught in her throat. She turned to the nurse's station, but it was still there, still silent, the strange feeling lingering in the air. She glanced back at the hallway, nothing. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her from the dark. Natalie stood frozen in the hallway, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. The hospital was eerily quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, their buzzing the only thing that broke the stillness. The figure at the end of the hall, the one she had seen moments ago, was gone. But the air was thick, suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something far beyond the realm of logic. She quickly glanced around, half expecting to see the figure behind her. Nothing. The hallway remained silent and lifeless. With a shaky breath, Natalie stepped cautiously back toward the nurse's station, her eyes darting nervously over the dark, abandoned corridor. Just as she reached the station, the intercom buzzed to life, breaking the silence with a sudden, shrill crackle. Her stomach tightened, and she hesitated before pressing the button. "Yes?" "Room 13, came the voice on the other end, dry and clipped. "Check on patient 304. "Immediately." Natalie frowned. "Room 13? That room had been empty for months. The hospital was small, and she knew that for sure. Her mind raced. Why had she not noticed the patient there before? Was there someone else on the floor she hadn't seen? She felt a cold chill crawl up her spine as she stood there, trying to convince herself it was just a mistake. But she knew deep down, something about this was off. The figure she had seen earlier was still fresh in her mind, its eerie presence lingering in the back of her thoughts. Reluctantly, she grabbed her flashlight and headed down the hallway. As she passed the darkened rooms, she felt the weight of the place settle on her chest. Every step felt like it echoed louder in the oppressive silence. The wall seemed to close in as she neared room 13. The door was cracked open, just slightly, and there was no light coming from the room, just an unsettling, inky darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. The door creaked as she slowly pushed it open, the flashlight trembling in her grip. The beam of light flicked across the room, landing on a single bed in the far corner. There was a figure lying there, unmoving. But it wasn't a patient. It was someone, or something else. A woman. She was pale, her hair dark and matted to her forehead. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, fingers intertwined, and her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead into nothingness. The woman's mouth was slightly open, but no sound came from her lips. The room smelled musty and old, and the air felt damp, thick with an unsettling presence. Natalie stepped forward, her pulse racing as she felt the cold air pressing in around her. She reached out with trembling hands to touch the woman's shoulder, but as soon as her fingers brushed against the skin, the woman's head jerked toward her, her eyes snapping into focus. "Get out!" The woman croaked, her voice low and distorted, as if it were a warning, or perhaps a plea. "You don't belong here." Natalie recoiled, a scream building in her throat, but before she could react, the woman's body lurched upward, jerking unnaturally. The dark shadows in the corners of the room seemed to come alive, swirling and twisting, as if they were drawn to the woman's sudden movement. Natalie staggered back, the flashlight slipping from her grip and rolling across the floor, casting erratic shadows on the walls. She tried to turn and run, but something was holding her, something invisible, but tangible. The coldness around her grew, sinking deep into her skin, and the shadows in the room seemed to pulse with life. "Leave me alone!" Natalie gasped, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The woman's mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, her lips curling back to reveal teeth that were far too sharp for a human. "It's too late," she hissed, her voice now a guttural growl that echoed throughout the room. "You can never leave." A freezing wind whipped through the room, and the walls seemed to close in on Natalie. The temperature dropped drastically, and the lights flickered above, plunging the room into a flickering half-darkness. Her legs were shaky, and she stumbled toward the door, her body moving on instinct. But as she reached for the door handle, it slammed shut, trapping her inside. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pressed her ear to the door, trying to hear something, anything, outside. The hallway was silent again, almost too silent. Her mind raced as she frantically tried to think of what to do next. She had to get out of there. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I just need to leave." From behind her, the woman's voice filled the room, now distorted and multiple, as if many voices were speaking at once. "You can't leave, Natalie. You're already part of it. You've always been part of it." Natalie whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, coalescing into dark, formless shapes that stretched toward her. The woman's figure was no longer just sitting on the bed. She was floating, suspended in the air, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "I've been waiting for you," the woman said, her voice now an eerie echo, filling the entire room. "I knew you would come. We all knew." Suddenly, Natalie felt a cold hand grip her ankle, pulling her toward the center of the room. She screamed, trying to claw at the floor, but the more she fought, the tighter the grip became. "No," she cried out, her voice desperate. "Let me go!" But the shadows around her only tightened, the coldness seeping deeper into her skin as the woman's figure loomed closer, her smile stretching further than what should have been humanly possible. "You've been marked," the woman said, her voice growing louder, more numerous, until it was a roar in Natalie's ears. "You're part of the hospital now. Forever." And in that moment, as the shadows consumed her, Natalie realized that she wasn't just caught in a nightmare. She was trapped in something far worse. The hospital had always been more than just a building. It had been waiting for her, waiting for all of them. As the darkness closed in around her, Natalie screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the very walls of the hospital itself. Natalie's body went cold as she was dragged further into the heart of the room. Her mind spun wildly as she fought to stay conscious, trying to break free from the invisible force pulling her deeper into the shadows. Her fingers scraped against the cold, cracked floor as she screamed for help, but her voice was drowned out by the oppressive hum of the darkness. The woman, no, thing, hovered above her, its grin stretching impossibly wide. "You don't understand," the woman said in a dozen voices, now a cacophony of eerie tones, each one dripping with malevolence. "This place is alive. It feeds on you. And now, it's hungry." With a violent jerk, the shadows enveloped Natalie completely, and the world around her shattered. For a moment, there was nothing, just a disorienting void that pulled at her from all directions, like she was falling through a black hole. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Her vision blurred, the edges of reality warping and twisting as the shadows began to take shape, forming into something tangible and horrifying. Suddenly, she was slammed back into the room. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled to her feet, but everything was different now. The room had changed, shifted. The walls were no longer familiar. They were warped, twisted, and covered in dark, crawling tendrils. The ceiling, once high and safe, had collapsed inward, pressing down with an unnatural weight. The woman's voice filled the air again, now soft, soothing, but with an undertone of terrifying finality. "You think you can escape, Natalie? You think you have a choice?" Natalie scrambled backward, her back pressing against the twisted wall as she tried to find any way out. Her hands slid across the grotesque surface of the room, as if the walls themselves were alive, pulsating beneath her touch. And then, there, just beyond the shadows, she saw it. A door. Not the one she had tried to escape from earlier. No, this one was different. It was cracked open slightly, revealing a faint light on the other side. But as she moved toward it, the air grew colder, and the shadows began to gather once more, swirling around her like a pack of predatory beasts. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "Not again." The figure in the corner, the thing, began to move. It slithered toward her with unnatural speed, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, fixed on her every movement. As it drew closer, its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, rotting teeth. "You will stay," it hissed, its breath cold and rancid. "You belong here." Natalie's breath quickened. She couldn't take it any longer. She couldn't stay here. She wouldn't let this place, this thing, take her soul. With all the strength she could muster, she pushed herself off the wall and sprinted toward the door. She had to get out, even if it was the last thing she did. But the moment her hand touched the door handle, the room seemed to freeze. The air thickened. The shadows in the corners of the room hissed and writhed. And then, just as her fingers gripped the cool metal, she heard a voice behind her, soft, almost gentle. "You can't escape it, Natalie," the voice whispered, not from the woman, but from something deeper, more primal. "You are part of it now." Before she could react, a cold hand gripped her wrist, its fingers sharp like claws. Natalie screamed, but the sound was muffled as the shadows wrapped around her, swallowing her in one swift motion. Her vision blurred, her body no longer hers to control. She couldn't feel the floor beneath her feet anymore. All she could feel was the cold, endless cold, as if she were drifting in a sea of nothingness. The voice came again, this time louder, more overwhelming. "You will stay with us. You will never leave. You will become part of the hospital. Forever." And then, As quickly as it had started, the shadows vanished. Natalie gasped for air, her lungs burning. The room had returned to its normal, familiar state, the sterile, empty walls of the hospital room. She was standing in front of the door, her hand still on the handle. The air was still. The lights overhead flickered once, then stabilized. But as her breath evened out, her heart still raced in her chest. She turned slowly. There, at the end of the hallway, stood the tall, dark figure she had seen earlier. Its eyes were cold, hollow voids, staring into her soul. It tilted its head, its smile impossibly wide. "You're not alone anymore, Natalie," it said, its voice soft and slow, as though savoring every word. "You belong to us now." Natalie's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees. Her body shook uncontrollably, her mind a blur of confusion and terror. The figure took one slow step forward, and then another, until it was standing directly in front of her, blocking her only escape. "Don't you understand?" the figure whispered. "You are the hospital now. This place, it lives in you." Suddenly, the walls around her began to crack. The floor buckled beneath her feet, the lights overhead flickering as the darkness returned, far thicker this time, far heavier. The voices of the other patients, the ones she hadn't seen, whispered in the darkness. Their voices filled her ears, their voices calling to her. "You can't run," the figure continued, its grin widening. "You never could. You were always meant to be here." As the darkness closed in, Natalie understood the truth. The hospital had claimed her, as it had claimed so many before her. There was no escape. There never had been. And as the shadow swallowed her whole, she became part of the thing that haunted those hallways, the thing that would never let her go. Natalie's mind raced as she dropped to her knees, feeling as though the weight of the entire hospital had collapsed on her shoulders. She gasped for air, her breath shallow, but every inhale seemed to grow colder, like she was breathing in ice. Her fingers dug into the floor, trying to hold on, trying to keep herself tethered to whatever reality still lingered in her grasp. But the reality she had known was slipping away, and the shadows were taking over. The figure at the end of the hallway moved again, gliding silently toward her. Each step echoed in the dead silence that had settled over the hospital. It wasn't just the tall, dark figure she had seen earlier. It was something more, something that felt ancient, as though it had been waiting here long before she had ever walked through those sterile hospital doors. "You should never have come back," the voice echoed in her head, soft yet deafening, its coldness burrowing deep into her soul. It wasn't just the figure speaking. It was all of them, the shadows, the whispers, the voices from the corners of the dark. Natalie's legs shook, and she struggled to rise. Her body felt like it wasn't her own anymore, weighed down by a force far beyond her control. Her hand reached out for the door, but her fingers slid across it as though the handle had turned to ice. "Let me out," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely a breath. But the figure was upon her now, its cold presence looming over her like a dark cloud. She didn't dare look up, but she could feel the figure's hollow eyes on her, piercing through her very soul. "You can't leave, Natalie," the figure whispered. Its tone was almost affectionate, a sickening contrast to the terror that gripped her. "You never truly belonged in the world outside these walls." The walls of the hospital seemed to pulse with a life of their own, breathing in sync with the shadows. The lights flickered again, casting brief moments of light that were quickly swallowed by the darkness. The air itself was thick, suffocating, pressing against her like 1,000 invisible hands. The whispering voices grew louder. They weren't coming from the figure anymore. No, the voices were coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, feeding on the fear and the despair that had accumulated within its walls. "Join us, Natalie," the figure said softly, its hand reaching down to touch her arm. Its fingers were icy cold, and the moment they made contact, her skin burned as though she had been branded. The pain shot through her like lightning, but there was no escape. She couldn't move. The shadows around her were closing in, suffocating her, and the whispers were louder now, more frantic. "You're ours," they chanted, their voices growing more distorted, more insistent. "Forever." And then, the hospital shifted again. The floor buckled beneath her, the walls twisted, and the once sterile hallway became a labyrinth of dark corridors, each one leading deeper into the heart of the hospital's dark presence. The figure before her smiled, an impossibly wide grin that stretched too far, revealing jagged, unnatural teeth. Its eyes burned with an unholy light. The door behind her slammed shut with an ear-splitting crack, and she knew that there would be no escape. The hospital had claimed her, as it had claimed so many before. Her heart raced as she realized the awful truth. She was now part of the place. She was one of its many lost souls. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness around her. The shadows twisted and swirled, their forms flickering like phantoms. Her mind began to unravel as the reality around her splintered and broke apart. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her entirely was the figure's face, inches from her own. It smiled, its grin widening until it seemed to devour her vision. "You were always meant to be here," it whispered, its voice merging with the voices of the others. "Welcome home." And as the darkness closed in, Natalie was lost to the hospital, to the shadows, to the terrifying truth that there was no escape from the curse that had been cast on this forsaken place. Her body was no longer her own. Her soul had been claimed, just like all the others who had walked these haunted halls. Natalie was now one of the lost. One of the many who had become part of the darkness. And there was no turning back. The end. Story 3, The Midnight Visitor. James had been working at the warehouse for almost 2 years, handling inventory and shipments during the graveyard shift. The place was large and dimly lit, with the smell of dust and old boxes hanging in the air. Most nights, the job was uneventful, with the only sounds coming from the whir of the machines and the shuffle of his feet across the cold concrete floor. But tonight was different. At exactly midnight, the door to the warehouse creaked open, though James was sure he had locked it before. He shrugged it off, thinking maybe the wind had pushed it open. But when he checked, the door was ajar, just wide enough for someone to slip through. James was alone, he was certain of that. But as he walked back to his station, he noticed something strange in the corner of his eye. A figure, standing near the back of the warehouse, just outside the reach of the dim lights. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. It was just there. James' heart pounded as he moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The figure was wearing a faded gray hoodie, its hood pulled low, hiding the face. As he reached the figure, James hesitated. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't answer. It didn't even acknowledge him. James took another step closer, and that's when he saw it, the hands. They were covered in dark stains, and they hung loosely at the figure's sides, as if they didn't belong to a human being. Suddenly, the figure turned toward him, and James' blood ran cold. Its face, its eyes, were hollow and empty. The figure's mouth opened in a slow, deliberate motion, but no sound came out. Instead, a low, unnatural hum began to fill the air. James could feel it deep in his chest, vibrating in his bones. The figure took a step forward, and that's when James turned and ran. James' heart pounded in his chest, and he stood frozen in place, his eyes locked on the figure that had appeared from nowhere. The warehouse was eerily silent now, save for the rustling of the wind outside. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds as the figure, the one dressed in a dark, tattered coat, slowly made its way across the cold concrete floor toward him. Every step the figure took seemed to echo louder in James' ears. He couldn't look away, even though every instinct in his body screamed at him to run. The man's face remained hidden under the hood, but there was something about the way he moved, something about the unnatural calmness of his presence, that sent chills up James' spine. The figure came to a stop just a few feet away from James, and for a moment, the two of them stood there, locked in an unsettling silence. James' throat went dry, and his mouth went suddenly dry as he tried to speak. Who are you?" he managed to stammer, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised a hand and slowly pulled back the hood, revealing a face that sent James' blood running cold. The man's face was gaunt and pale, his features sharp and hollow, as though he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto James with an intensity that made his stomach twist in fear. "I'm here for you," the man said, his voice low and gravelly, like it hadn't been used in years. His lips curled into a thin, unsettling smile, revealing yellow teeth that looked far too sharp for comfort. James' breath hitched. "What do you mean? What do you want with me?" The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I've been watching you, James. You don't belong here anymore. Not in this world, not in this life. The deal is done." "Deal?" James' mind raced, trying to make sense of the cryptic words. What was he talking about? A deal? Was this some kind of prank? But the man's words made something shift inside James. He had never seen this person before, but something about him felt familiar. The sensation was terrifying. He felt like he had been waiting for this moment his entire life, like this figure was somehow tied to him in a way he couldn't understand. The man's gaze never left him, and for the first time since meeting the stranger, James felt something he hadn't before: fear. "You've already made the choice, James," the figure continued, his voice rising with a hint of something darker. "You accepted it a long time ago. You just didn't remember. But I remember. I remember everything." James' legs buckled under him, and he collapsed to the floor, a sense of dread washing over him. His mind was foggy, memories flashing through his mind, but they were disjointed, blurred. He couldn't understand what the man was talking about. "No, I don't. What are you talking about? What did I do?" James felt his voice crack as he begged for answers, his heart racing as the truth seemed just out of reach. The man stepped closer, his breath cold against James' ear as he whispered, "You made the deal when you signed the papers. The papers for the job here. The warehouse. This place, it's more than just a building. It's a prison. And you, James, are its next soul." James' blood ran cold as his mind began to piece the fragments together. He remembered when he had first applied for the job, how easy it had been to get hired, how the man who interviewed him seemed almost too eager to bring him on board. He had signed the contract without a second thought, too desperate for the work. But the details of the agreement had been a blur, things he had overlooked, things he had ignored. His head spun, the weight of the realization sinking in like a lead anchor. The warehouse wasn't just a place of work, it was a prison, and it had been waiting for him. "No," James whispered, shaking his head, his hands trembling. "No, this can't be real. You're lying. The man crouched down, bringing his face so close to James that he could smell the decay on his breath. "I'm not lying, James. This place owns you now. You've always belonged to it. You just didn't know it." With a sudden jerk, the man reached out and grabbed James by the wrist, pulling him to his feet with inhuman strength. His fingers were icy cold, like metal, sending an electric jolt of terror through James. His stomach lurched as he tried to break free, but the grip tightened, pulling him toward the center of the warehouse. "I tried to warn you," the man said, his voice growing quieter, almost sorrowful. "But it's too late now. This place has already taken your soul. There's no way out." The shadows in the warehouse shifted, crawling up the walls like dark vines, their tendrils creeping toward James. The temperature in the room dropped, and his breath came out in visible clouds. The darkness seemed to pulse with life, as though the building itself was alive, feeding on fear. James struggled, panic rising as the coldness of the room consumed him. His heart raced. "I didn't know. I didn't know about the deal. It doesn't matter," the man interrupted, his voice soft but chilling. "Once you sign the contract, you're bound to the warehouse. And the warehouse always collects its due." Suddenly, the floor beneath James' feet began to shake. The walls creaked and groaned as if they were coming to life. The shadows grew thicker, swallowing the light. And then, from the darkness, a low, inhuman growl rumbled through the warehouse, echoing off the walls. James spun around, his heart pounding in his ears. The shadows in the corners of the room coalesced, forming into a figure, a monstrous, twisted shape, with glowing red eyes and an open mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth. The figure lunged toward him, and James screamed. James' scream was cut short as the monstrous figure lunged toward him, its glowing red eyes burning with an insatiable hunger. He barely had time to react before the darkness swallowed him whole. He struggled, trying to break free, but the figure's form was shifting, pulsating like a living nightmare. The shadows wrapped around him, dragging him toward the ground, the cold biting into his skin like needles. His chest tightened, panic coursing through his veins. The warehouse, which had once felt like just an empty building, now seemed like an ancient, living entity, pulsating with energy. It was alive. He was its prey. The man in the dark coat stood nearby, watching as James struggled in the grasp of the dark figure. His face remained emotionless, cold. "You made the choice, James," he repeated, his voice a haunting whisper that echoed through the warehouse. "Now you pay the price." The growling from the shadows grew louder as the figure pressed closer, its gaping mouth opening wider, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. The coldness around James intensified as he was pulled deeper into the dark figure's body, its form wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. He could feel the icy chill of its breath on his skin, and with each passing moment, the pressure became unbearable. But then, something unexpected happened. A flash of light, a faint glow, pierced through the darkness, cutting through the suffocating cold. James blinked, his eyes watering as he tried to focus on the light. It was coming from the far corner of the warehouse, where a crack had appeared in the walls, a sliver of brightness shining through. "Go," a voice urged, soft but firm. It was the same voice that had come from the shadows before, but this time it felt different, familiar, almost human. With everything he had left, James fought against the darkness, pushing himself forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the crack in the wall. The dark figure hissed behind him, its teeth snapping just inches from his back. The temperature plummeted further, and James could feel the very air choking him, but the light, bright, warm, was just within his reach. He shoved his hand through the crack, feeling the coolness of the concrete wall as his fingers slipped through. And with one final push, he pulled himself through the wall, tumbling into the light. The moment his body passed through the crack, the darkness screamed. The oppressive pressure lifted, and James felt the weight of the shadows lifting from his shoulders. He gasped for air, his lungs burning as he stumbled into a small, dimly lit room. The door behind him slammed shut, sealing the darkness away. James collapsed to the floor, his hands trembling, his body soaked with sweat. He could still hear the growls, the whispers of the warehouse, but they were faint, distant now. He sat there, his head spinning as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. He had escaped, but for how long? Could he truly leave this place behind? As his breathing slowed, he looked around the room, his eyes trying to make sense of his surroundings. It looked like another part of the warehouse, an old storage room filled with forgotten boxes and rusted equipment. The room was bathed in an eerie, flickering light, but there was no sign of the figure, no shadowy presence looming over him. But then, in the corner of the room, he saw something. It was a mirror. An old, cracked mirror, standing tall and framed in tarnished gold. The reflection in the mirror wasn't James, though. It was the figure in the coat, the one with the cold, hollow eyes. It stared at him through the glass, its face expressionless, but there was something unsettling in its gaze. "You can never truly escape," the figure's voice echoed from the mirror. "This is where you belong. You will always return. You will always be part of us." James' heart raced again, and he staggered backward, his legs weak beneath him. The mirror seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the figure's smile stretched impossibly wide. "No," James whispered, shaking his head. "I'm done. I'm not going back." But the reflection in the mirror didn't respond. It simply watched him, its cold eyes unblinking, unwavering. Suddenly, the door to the room behind him creaked open. James spun around, his breath catching in his throat. A figure stepped through the door, a man, wearing a familiar dark coat, his face hidden beneath the hood. He walked toward James slowly, deliberately, as if time itself was standing still. "You really think you can escape?" The man's voice was low, filled with an unsettling calm. "You're already in too deep. You've already made your choice, James. There is no turning back." James stumbled backward, his mind racing. His pulse was deafening in his ears. Was this it? Was he trapped forever in this cycle of torment, unable to break free from the grip of the warehouse and its dark forces? But just before the man could reach him, something else happened. The faint light from the crack in the wall began to grow brighter, spilling into the room, pushing back the shadows. "No," the voice from before spoke again. "You are not meant to stay here." The light intensified, engulfing James, pushing the figure back, forcing it to retreat. The man in the coat hissed as the light grew stronger, its presence filling the room. And then, with a final scream, the figure vanished, swallowed by the light. James blinked, his head spinning. The warehouse, the darkness, had receded, leaving him in the warmth of the light. But as the light began to fade, and the darkness crept back into the edges of the room, James realized the truth. The warehouse was never truly gone. The deal, the binding contract, was etched into his soul, and no matter how far he ran, it would always find him. He was never free. And as the darkness crept back around him, James understood that he was now part of something far worse than he could ever have imagined. James collapsed to his knees as the darkness closed in around him. The light had faded, and with it, the last shred of hope he'd clung to. The warmth from the crack in the wall was gone, And now, all that remained was the suffocating cold of the warehouse, its shadows alive with hunger, waiting to reclaim what was always meant to be theirs. The man in the dark coat appeared once again, this time standing at the center of the room. His face was still hidden by the hood, but his presence was undeniable. He seemed to tower over James, the weight of his existence pressing down on James' chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. "You still don't understand, do you, James?" The man's voice was calm, unnervingly so, like a father explaining a lesson to a child who refused to listen. "You were always meant to be here. This warehouse, it's not just a place. It's a doorway. And you walked through it willingly." James struggled to breathe, his thoughts clouded by confusion and terror. The shadows were gathering again, whispering from every corner, a constant, low hum in his ears. They were closing in on him, curling around his legs like a trap that was about to snap shut. "I didn't know," James gasped, his hands trembling as he pressed them against the cold concrete floor. "I had no idea. I didn't know about the contract, about any of this. I didn't choose this." The figure stepped closer, its dark presence overwhelming. "You may not have known, but you still chose. You chose to come here. You signed your name, not with ink, but with your soul. The moment you entered this place, you became a part of it." James' mind raced, trying to grasp the gravity of what the figure was saying. The warehouse had claimed him. He had been a fool, desperate for work, desperate to escape his past. And now, he was tied to it forever. The shadows, thick and suffocating, wrapped tighter around his body, pinning him in place. The darkness pressed down on him, choking the life out of him, but it wasn't the physical weight that terrified him most. It was the realization that his soul, his very essence, had been marked irrevocably. There was no escape. No freedom. The man in the coat raised his hand slowly, the shadows parting before him as he did. "The deal is done," he said, his voice taking on a cold finality. "And now, you will live here, in the shadows, in the dark corners of the warehouse. You are the newest soul in its collection." James' heart hammered in his chest as the darkness swirled around him, thickening and pulsing, until it felt as though it were alive, breathing, waiting, feeding. His body tensed as he felt the pull, felt the warehouse's insatiable hunger draw him closer, deeper into its grasp. "No," James whispered hoarsely, his eyes wide with fear. "Please, no, I can't stay here." The man's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile that offered comfort. It was cruel, satisfied, as if the man had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "You can try to fight it, James. You can try to resist. But it won't matter. The warehouse will always find you. It will always claim what's been promised." The shadows reached up, wrapping around James' throat, pulling him into the depths of the dark void. His body felt numb, cold, as though every part of him was being erased, fading away into the endless night. And yet, he couldn't stop it. No matter how much he fought, no matter how much he screamed, the darkness pressed in, suffocating him. As the last vestiges of his strength faded, James realized that he was no longer fighting to survive. He wasn't trying to escape anymore. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of surrender. The darkness wasn't just consuming him, it was becoming a part of him. The warehouse was inside him now, its presence lingering in every corner of his mind, every whisper in his ear. In that moment, as he finally let go, he understood. The warehouse didn't just claim his soul. It had his soul. It was the true keeper of it, the thing that would never let go. And as the darkness fully enveloped him, James became one with the very place he had so desperately tried to escape. The endless void, the shadows, the whispers, they were now his eternal prison. The end. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.